To begin, let's go back to the 1980s in the United States. Ivar Mikashov was an American pianist who lived in New York, a close collaborator and promoter of the avant-garde of his time. His early versions of works by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, John Cage, and Alvin Curran, among other post-war composers, are very important. Also, devoted to the music of the Rio de la Plata, especially tango, he commissioned pieces from numerous composers such as Conlon and Carrow, Niels Vigeland, Corium Aharonian, Oliver Knussen, Aaron Copland, and John Cage, among many others. John Cage composed his tango for Ivar in 1984 and entitled it Perpetual Tango, a piece that puts indeterminacy over pitch in the first place. It only offers us the indication of big range and a marking of differences in the writing of the note heads, which indicate the types of objects, single note, major third, and just fourth, and thus put in open conception of the work. The performer must decide on the organization of tempi, discrete pitches, and dynamics to be played. In the center is the enigmatic phrase, which also shows us the starting point of the work, Erik Satie's Le Tango Perpetuel, from the Sports and Divertissements, writing in 1914. The devil never takes time to think he chooses tangos. Instead, he is quiet, he cool, his daughter's wife and servant. No, they never stop dancing, they never do, it's very hot. In the capital letter forms the name Erik Satie twice. In addition, the resulting rhythmic writing is a filtering of Satie's piece. Cage is removing values to the linear continuity of the original, and so there are left over the rhythmic stripes of Satie's tango. John Cage's text is inspired by Satie's work, which is a piece written in a style that is, taking the rhythmic style of the dance and elaborating a typical tango texture that dialogues with the pianistic writing of the French composer. In other words, Satie relearns within his own piano style a version of the tango. The reception of a fashionable musical style in the Paris of the 20s converges in a salon piece of sport and divertissements. The repetition sign at the end of the piece is very suggestive, as it imprints a cyclical character to the work, as in the case of his piece Vexations, here a perpetual tango. Ivar Mikashov recorded two versions of John Cage's tango on an album entitled Incitation to Desire for the New Albion Records label, which compiled many of the tangos dedicated to him. The legacy of Ivar's early death in 1993 has, at the Library of the University of Buffalo in New York, 127 tangos in the collection. Argentine connection. In the early 90s of the last century, the Argentine pianist Aide Schwartz, Mikashov's disciple at the University of Buffalo, began the project of recording an album dedicated to the music of the 20th century. Among pieces by Mauricio Kagel, Giacinto Scelsi, and Gerardo Gandini, she invited a group of Argentine composers to cover John Cage's tango. In 1989, Mariano Etkin wrote a version of John Cage's Perpetual Tango. His reading of the Perpetual Tango follows the guidelines of Cage's request in the choice of pitches and the configuration of a linear gesture, where we find a use of melodic chromaticism in the area of a just fifth on a polarity in B minor major. Etkin scrupulously respects the rhythmic and the organization of the pitches with a marked linear continuity. the foreground achromatic selections that border on polar notes, such as the B in the bass or the F in the right hand. Before his death, Mikashov declared Haydn Schwartz executor of his collection of tangos, which, in turn, in 2001, called upon several composers, this time Argentinian, to compose new tangos. The International Tango Collection, in its Argentine version, consists of a group of tangos that he premiered in Buenos Aires in 2003 at the Goethe Institute in Buenos Aires. As a result of this event, Mariano Etkin wrote a tango entitled Pobres Triunfos Pasajeros, Poor Peasant Triumphs, with the suggestive subtitle of Modern Tango. At the beginning of the piece, the coexistence of numerous different materials, line, contrachord, chord as a block, cluster, the linearity of the basis of the 2/4 time signature is striking in the writing of a diatonic expressive line with a chromatic beating to the G and permanently bordering an apparent minor mode in D. In the alternation of diatonic and chromatic passages, especially as ornamentations, we see how Etkin dialogues with the linear gesture of tango and its lyric. The idea of writing the phrasing has its correlate in the starting point of the 2/4 time signature, typical of the writing of classic tangos, and a meter that widens 4/4 or contracts 3/8. This meter as consonance 2/4 runs with these elaborate variants of expansion and contraction. At the same time, we have the writing of irregularity, bar 7, in the idea of making invisible the count of the division of the pulse from a rhythmic writing that stress the clarity of each pulse. In measure 7, a singular coexistence, a dissonance not only in the pitches due to the cluster, but at the same time a metrical dissonance due to the presence of the irregular value that takes the half of the measure in its displacement anencephaly. The return to Argentina of the Satie and Cage line by Schwartz allows a rereading of several Argentine composers of the experimental writing tradition in close connection with the genre tradition. These multiple resonances and reappropriations in the context of the binomial negation, resignification, and hybridization between different traditions, not only that of the genre itself, but also that of the post-Ditela experimentation in Argentina. The subtitle that Etkin places in the score, Tango Moderno, marks these conceptions while denoting a subtle irony. Since tango from its very genesis is a product of modernism in Buenos Aires at the beginning of the 20th century, what does the modern allude to? As the composer points out, perhaps alerting the listener to the tango of an avant-gardism alien to its tradition? A Raining Good Friday. Gerardo Gandini's approach could not be more opposite to that of Etkin. Pianist of Astor Piazzolla's Last Sextet, Gandini played Piazzolla's composition first hand. In 2003, he composed his tango Viernes Santo y Lluvioso, dedicated to pianist Haydn Schwartz and her collection of tangos. The work begins with a texture of chord arpeggios with 7 and 9 chords of ascending and descending movement that frame an oscillating and flexible gesturing tempo. From there, a chant emerges at measure 3, D, to measure 7 with the F, with an impossible Schumannian mezza di voce on a single note. From there, it descends to the accented G to retake the forgotten F and bring a well-descending movement that, like rain, fall in a temper-degree range together with the bass of the A that will be barely held in a syncopation around measures 9-10. Continuing the descendant to the D, a new descending gesture from the A to the octave and more bounded falls into the B bemol minor chord with measure 7 with a new mezza di voce. During all this time, the accompaniment consists of plaqué chords, some with an ornamentation, as in the case of the B bemol major in measure 10. After the B bemol minor chord in measure 12, the singing of isolated notes returns with the A bemol and the ascending arpeggios of the accompaniment from D and then from A bemol. This whole first section is framed with the use of molto pedal requested by the composer and which configures the typical resonant sonority of Gandini's pianism. As he writes in his famous work Eusebius, 1984, in the four nocturnes there must be a constant and enveloping use of the pedals. Gandini uses materials typical of the language of tango, such as harmony with added sound, monody with cantabile accompaniment, and a cantabile line, all of them coated with a modernity typical of the genre, but also in the reading of Tango from Gandini's universe. Both the resonant sonority resulting from the use of the pedal, as well as the harmonic treatment with the background harmony described in Schoenberg Theatrice, and that form a sound plot of isolated chords with no apparent relationship. This poetic use of Schoenberg's background harmonies with no apparent tonal connection was very inspiring for Gandini around this time and allowed him to compose his third piano sonata, 2001, a year before Viernes Santo. Thus, the tonal plan he uses in the first section turned out to be the connection of chords cannot be subsumed to any main tonic. Instead, polarities are constituted as we see in the sound of the A minor at the beginning, or the polychord at the end in the griot concluding arpeggio resulting from the juxtaposition of three chords, A bemol, C, and G, forming a sonorous harmonic constellation. The second section, from the double bar, elaborates these materials in a progressive development until suddenly a gesture of the old tango appears, the subito ritmico element, and a tempo senza pedal in clear opposition to the previous sonority. This element, defined as an object trouvé of tango, burst is an episodic element and brings back the memory of the genre, a typical gesture of the tango before returning to the recapitulation of the first section for the closing of the piece. According to these guidelines, we observe how Gandini, such a two-faced genius, navigates in two waters simultaneously. Not only does Viernes Santo bring a new perspective in the application of the background harmonies in the context of tango, and thus continue the elaboration of what he embodied in the Tercera Sonata, but at the same time he dialogues from his reading of the resonant cantabile that we find in the classic slow movements of Piazzolla, as in Soledad or the Milonga del Ángel. Tango, post-tango, and finally tango big band. Gandini has told on numerous occasions what Piazzolla told him when he heard him play the piano. Gandini, you play the piano like an Italian. In tango there has to be dirt. This reference to the denial of the preciousness of what is known as the pearly sound of the piano school of the classical repertoire is opposite to the search for a sonority of certain roughness of the piano in tango. At the same time, Gandini's practice of tango as Piazzolla pianist also allowed him to play with improvisation with the genre, since Piazzolla himself asked him to improv the piano part he had written, as Gandini himself says, except for the introduction of Adios Nonino, which he respected to the letter. The piano parts are of his own making. The genealogy of the post-tangos has told by Gandini begins with the now famous transition solo of La Chumba, a classic tango by Pugliese, and which owes its title to the dragging of the bass in glissando, generally done by the double bass, and which Pugliese himself replicated with his left hand on the piano. Gandini says, "At the time when we were in Amsterdam with Pugliese, he told me, 'Che, don't play that shit I wrote. Invent something that goes from La Chumba to Adios Nonino.' Then I made that transition that became famous." Pugliese was totally bewildered, as were Piazzolla musicians. "We had to leave the place because they want to kill us." Laws. In that concert in Amsterdam, Gandini takes the arrastre motif and varies it with new harmonies, many of them derived from jazz, and at the same time frenetically elaborates that motif, to the surprise and perplexity of the musicians, but with the celebration of the audience. That night not only met the tradition of the genre represented by Pugliese, one of its most beloved protagonists, and the avant-garde of the most discussed tango in Piazzolla, but also the avant-garde of Argentine composition post-Ditela, profaning and at the same time joining two of the most classic tangos in the genre. The post-tangos were put together in a set of recordings resulting from this improvisation on classics of the genre, including several tangos by Piazzolla. In some tangos, the approach is that of a free improvisation in the manner of free jazz that completely blurs any obligatory reference to a tonal plan, harmonic rhythm and counterpoint, or a monody texture with accompaniment typical of the genre. This happens in the pieces that have a strongly written material such as El Choclo or La Comparsita. In them, he brings into play the variation on the rhythmic and motivic gesture that is projected to new textures and not always toward an exposition of the original material. In other words, he brings into play proliferation as a permanently decentrated variation. In short, Gandini works with the tango genre as an object trouvé, as music from his sound memory, the sound of his childhood in Buenos Aires, but at the same time, and although the practice of tango until his encounter with Piazzolla was null, we see that it is perfectly inserted in his poetics. He applies his compositional procedures to these objects from a performative practice detached from notation, but now inserted in improvisation and listening. In 2003, Gandini was commissioned to compose a tango album produced by the Westdeutsche Rundfunk Köln for a big band formation. The project, entitled Tango y Post-Tango, synthesizes the notion of crossover and hybridization between tango tradition and the avant-garde, with important soloists such as Nestor Marconi on bandoneon, Ernest Reisecker on cello and Mark Walker on drums, the direction and compositions of Gerardo Gandini. A set of pieces among which there are some new ones such as Café de la Musique, or new versions of others such as Nube or Viernes Santo Lluvioso. The album is profused in the elaborate contrapuntal writing, asymmetrical rhythms a la Bartók, chamber orchestration reminiscent of the Stravinsky of L'Histoire du Soldat, as in Café de la Musique, as well as the sonorities of the resonant and very expressive cantabile, as in La Nube, and of a lyrical typical of the intricate variations of tango as we find in the lyrical clarinet solo of La Nostalgia. Tango y post-tango dialogues in Gandini compositions not only with the listening and performance experience of Piazzolla work in the tradition of the genre, but also with a good part of the harmonic, rhythmic, and timbral inquiries of the avant-garde music of the 20th century. Thus, we find heterophonic or polyphonic textures by layering, as in Gata Escapada, Cat Escaped, and the construction of asymmetrical rhythms reminiscent of the Stravinsky of Les Sacres du Printemps in magnetic resonance, as well as in the neoclassical taste of the brass tutis of the Stravinsky of the Symphony for Wind Instruments in Tribute to Astor. In sum, this encounter between the different experimental musical traditions which emerged in the 60s in Argentina seems to close an era, while opening new horizons of an avant-garde in the South in a continuous hybridization, the art of rereading.